For those of you who are unfamiliar with film, film is a photographic medium that records images using light-sensitive chemicals instead of a digital sensor. Film works when photons hit the light-sensitive crystals on the film and cause a chemical change in the film, which creates what's called a latent image. That latent image becomes an actual image when the film is developed using film processing chemicals. This video discusses Fuji Fujichrome Velvia RVP 50 slide, or also called reversal film, and looks at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and sample images. In this video, we'll refer to it simply as Velvia 50, which is the common terminology. Velvia 50 is a slow-speed reversal, or slide, film rated at 50 ISO, which is 18 DIN. Velvia 50 is available in 35mm and 120 readily, and with a little bit more difficulty in 4x5 and 8x10. This subjective film characteristics section looks at film characteristics and has my take on them. We'll look at grain, tonality and tonal range, acutance, contrast, sharpness, dynamic range, also called gamma. I'll provide some additional notes, some good uses for the stock, and describe my experience converting it to digital formats. For grain, Velvia 50 has virtually none. For tonality and tonal range, it's excellent. This is a slide film, so it's not going to have the tonal range that, like 8 stops of tonal range, like some good black and white films have. It's not going to happen here. But Velvia 50 can capture 3, maybe 4 stops of tonal range, and by slide film standards, that's very good. That means, for those of you who have not shot slide film before, that this is a different experience from C41 or black and white stocks, which have a much greater tonal range and therefore more forgiveness and exposure settings. For acutance, it's excellent with Velvia 50. Contrasts between adjoining regions of bright to dark is excellent, and it's quick. It's not this blurry or drawn out transition. Transitions between contrast areas are also readily discernible. That translates in your images to a better level of detail when viewing the entire negative. For contrast, this is separate from acutance, but contrast on this film is high. This is a higher contrast film stock, and a big part of that is because this is a slide film. What that means is that the shadows in this film don't retain very much, if any, data when they're underexposed. Likewise, highlights tend to blow out pretty quickly. So if you have high contrast scenes, this film's going to struggle, whereas if you have even lighting across your scene, this film's really going to shine. For sharpness, it's exceptional in Velvia 50. Image detail within photos taken on this stock is spectacular. To put it in numbers, Velvia 50 resolves at up to 160 line pairs per millimeter under ideal conditions. That's really high. That's almost as high as the best lenses are able to resolve. It's significantly higher than most, if not all, of the film stocks we've looked at heretofore in this series. For dynamic range, the film's gamma, slide films have a steeper gamma line in general than do black and white or color films, and this manifests in the contrast being higher with this film. And that's because these films are engineered to show the image that you see on them with light coming through them, instead of creating an image where light reflects off of it. When you have a color negative or a black and white film, you're taking that and you're making a print out of it. That's the way these are engineered. With slide film, you're projecting light through it and broadcasting the image onto a different medium like a white surface, as in a slide projector, to view the image. In order to have an image with light projected through it that looks as good as an image that's created by light reflecting off of it, the gamma line or the contrast has to be greater. Some additional notes on this film. Slide films are not color negative or black and white films. I've said a couple times. They can't be pushed and pulled is what that means in this context. Slide films are not as forgiving of exposure errors, and they also lose the highlight detail and fail to gain shadow detail quite easily. So it's a much different shooting experience for film users who have only ever shot negative films to come into slide film. If you're looking at slide films, Velvia should not be the first one you try. Some good uses for Velvia are portraits. Just number one, Velvia 50 is an exceptional portrait film. It's also stunning for landscape, architecture, and sunsets. Places where you have rich lighting or where you can create your own lighting are places where Velvia is really going to do well for you as a photographer. It's not great for sports due to the slow speed. 50 ISO is way, way, way too slow for sports photography, unless we're talking about portraits of sports stars, but then we're back to it being a great portrait film. Velvia 50 is also not well suited for complex and high contrast lighting situations, such as where the sun is in the scene or behind clouds that are in the scene. That said, I did say this is a good sunset film, and it is, because it captures the sunset colors really, really well. But you're not going to have a whole lot of foreground detail when you're taking sunset photos. And if you're out in the middle of the day and the sun gets into your frame, you can basically forget about having a good amount of image detail across your frame. Either you're going to completely blow out the sky, or you're going to meter for the sky and have no foreground detail. The same is also true if you have a bright light source of any kind in your frame. That's just something to bear in mind with this film. It doesn't have the dynamic range, and it doesn't retain shadow and highlight details as readily as films with a greater dynamic range. So if you have bright light in your frame, it's going to be hard to use and your results are going to suffer. For digital conversion, Velvia converts to digital images beautifully. If you scan the film, it scans relatively well. If you digitize with a DSLR like I do, which means taking basically a picture of the negative with light coming through it, or in this case, the slide with light coming through it, DSLR digitization is amazing for slide films like Velvia. Raw files will have a lot of information in them, and you can pull more out of this film than you will be able to see just looking at it. That's comparing it to scanned versions. If you have a DSLR and you use this film, I strongly recommend digitizing it with the DSLR and just passing on the scanners, because no scanner, no matter how good, is going to give you images like a good DSLR's raw files. Okay, so this is the spectral sensitivity curve for Velvia 50. What we're seeing here are the different wavelengths of light from 400 to 700, that's blue to red, we'll see that in a second, and the sensitivity of each of the three different layers. Velvia has three different dye layers, a blue sensitive, a green sensitive, and a red sensitive layer. Now if we overlay the color spectrum here, you can see that the green sensitive layer is sensitive from slightly into the cyan through green into the dark yellow range. The red layer is sensitive from dark yellow, peaking at orange, and then declining rapidly in the red layer. The blue layer, I'm touching on this last, is because it's sensitive across the purple and blue spectrum pretty evenly. What that means for this film is that it's very biased towards the blues and the greens. One of the reasons I've said this makes a great sunset film is because oranges it's very sensitive to, but also blues. So you can capture the light from the sun reflecting off of the clouds at sunset, as well as the blues of the sky, and then the green and yellow will capture the foreground detail, especially if you're in a place that has a lot of greenery. An important thing to notice is that the peaks here are roughly equal, and they're also centered on colors that can generally be made with this film, made to be very bold with this film without great effort. So for instance, as you're looking through the slideshow in this video, you'll notice that blues really jump off the image. Green yellows, pretty well, that mostly translates into green digitally, pretty much jumps off the image. Oranges, holy cow, oranges on this film in the sunset photos taken with this film really jump off. And that's because of what we're seeing here with the way that each of the different layers are sensitive to different colors. A key thing to note is that it is least sensitive in the cyan and the bright yellow range, excluding purple and red. But where it has sensitivity is least sensitive in those brighter colors. Now, when we see color, we equate dark color with richness and saturation, and bright versions of those colors with less saturation and less richness. A deep blue people tend to see as being a richer, more pleasing blue than a very bright blue. This film's image characteristic of having saturated and rich colors comes from the fact that it is more saturated. It records light better in the dark areas of the color spectrum than it does in the bright areas of the color spectrum. And that's a key thing to understand about this film. It sees cyan and it sees yellow. It just doesn't record them with as much color depth, or intensity would maybe be a better word, as it does purples, dark blues, dark greens, and oranges. That means that those brighter colors of cyan and yellow are going to be somewhat muted compared to the other tones. This leads to skies in natural settings being more dramatic because in the case of skies, the cyan would be less prevalent and the bluer, darker bluer colors would be more prevalent. That makes skies darker and more blue. For natural settings, the yellow will be less dominant and that will make the greens and the browns more dominant. Also, having less yellow in an image amplifies the blue in that same image, adding further drama to skies. That's one of the things that makes this film so nice for landscapes and other natural settings. All right, so here's the film's characteristic curve. First thing, let's note that this curve is reversed from a normal negative film. So if you've seen my other videos, the curve starts low on the left and peaks on the right. And this is backwards, hence the term reversal film. What this is telling us is that with longer exposure time, the film becomes continually lighter or continually overexposed until it finally becomes clear. And I did have that happen with a couple of frames where it just got clear because I way overexposed it. In my experience, Velvia tends to be completely see-through at about 5 stops over the correct exposure. Also note that when you underexpose Velvia 50, its red tones are somewhat brighter than the greens and the blues. And we know that because the red line on this graphic is lower. Remember, everything on this graphic is reversed from normal, so where the line is lower, that means brighter. This means that if you intentionally underexpose your images at sunset, as some of the examples you're seeing in the slideshow portion of this video, when the clouds are lit by the sun going over the horizon, you're going to obtain darker and richer skies with bright clouds just blazing amazing colors. This next photo demonstrates that. From 1 second to 1/4000th of a second, no reciprocity correction is needed. For most people, that's going to be just fine. Realistically, with this film being a 50 ISO film, unless you have an f1.2 lens and you're taking pictures directly pointed at the sun, you're not likely to go over 1/4000th of a second anyway. I can't honestly envision a setting in which you would have enough light and be able to deliver a good image to shoot faster than a 4,000th of a second. For shots beyond 1 second, which is to say longer exposure times, additional time and color compensating are required. Being a slide film, you're going to see color shifts, and Velvia 50 shifts to the green with longer exposures. So the M, where it says color compensating filter for 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 seconds. Well, 64 is not recommended. Anyway, for those 4 color filters, 5M through 12.5M, the M stands for magenta. You can get those in gel filters. It's harder to find those in glass filters. So what I did was I added shading to the boxes, all 4 of them, including the 5 and the 7.5, for shading that is the shade of that color magenta filter. The shading in those boxes is based on Lee color compensating filter colors. I did take long exposures with this film. In fact, I pushed it well beyond what you're supposed to. My longest exposure was indoor at 35 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, something like that. And we were under fluorescent light at the time. Here's that photo. There is a palpable green shift in this image. However, it is surprisingly not so bad in that greenness doesn't stand out unless I'm telling you it's there, which it is. You can see it now that I've said it. So Fuji does not recommend exposures longer than a minute with Velvia 50. And in my experience, there isn't a whole lot of value to it because this film doesn't have the ability to, it's not as durable in terms of exposure latitude as a black and white or a color negative film. So overexposing it is going to blow out your highlights in brighter parts of the image, or I should say long exposures will blow out your highlights in brighter parts of the image and will not give you as much shadow detail as you would get in negative films. So you can use it for long exposures, but realistically pushing it beyond a minute is more than this film's designed for, and there's not a whole lot of benefit to you. If you're finding that you really want to do 5-minute exposures in slow speed color film, a color negative film is going to do a better job for you. Velvia 50, as I've mentioned, does not have tons of latitude. You can underexpose it for specific effects, such as more dramatic or saturated colors, but overexposing it is simply going to blow out your highlights. Also, push and pull processing it, I didn't try it because I checked out some samples of what it would look like online. I was unimpressed. Didn't see any specific benefit to it, so I don't recommend pushing and pulling this film. I don't think you're going to get anything new or exciting or special out of it that you would, say, with a black and white film where pushing and pulling changes the image characteristic. All of that said, I recommend shooting Velvia at the box speed. If you're at a point in your photographic journey where you're shooting Velvia and you want to get the best images out of it, you also know that pushing and pulling it's not going to give you a whole lot. So box speed it is for this film, or it should be anyway. Velvia can, in certain settings, benefit from color compensating filters. I found those conditions to be rare. I can think of 2 or 3 photos that I took where I thought, it would have been nice to have a color compensating filter. I never used any, and I never found myself feeling like they were mandatory. And in today's digital processing era, they aren't. You can, with the push of a few buttons, you can fix any color shift errors that you have in your film without the need to buy and learning how to use a color compensating filter. As for recommended formats, I shot Velvia in 4x5 sheet film, 120 and 35mm. It's spectacular in 35mm, really it is. It's one of the few films that I will say is a joy to shoot in every format. My favorite, it would be hard to pick between 4x5 and 120. 120 really delivers great images. 4x5 was a trip though, and seeing a slide that's the size of a normal print is great. So if you shoot 4x5 and you have the ability to get your hands on a box of this in sheet film, it's worth it even just to try it once. I bought my sheet film in 2018. It was 20 sheets, it was $120 plus developing. Ended up that each 4x5 image that I took with this film was something in the range of $16 or $18. This is not a cheap film to shoot in 4x5. It might have been $22 per shot. Anyway, it was a lot of money to shoot this in large format. So if you're gonna do that, really learn this film in small and medium format first. I did not use a light meter at all for any of my large format images, but I strongly, strongly recommend that you do if you're going to be shooting this film in any camera, in any format that doesn't have a light meter on it. Fuji Fujichrome RVP Velvia 50. You can see why I've called it Velvia 50 throughout this video. It's my favorite slide film, period. To my eye, it's the best slide film ever made in terms of colors, sharpness, details, and overall image character. There's a lot of Kodachrome nostalgia. Kodachrome, and I used it, has diddly on Velvia 50, except that it came in even slower speeds than 50 ISO. You can shoot anything with Velvia 50 that the ISO will allow. It's ideal for portraits, architecture, landscapes, sunsets, and one great use for this, if you like landscapes, are waterfalls that are out of direct sunlight. That way you can get a slower shutter speed in a 1/4 to a 1/2 second range, maybe 2 seconds, and really capture water moving through waterfalls so that it looks like delicate gossamer thread around these richly saturated rocks and other settings in your scene. Shooting Velvia 50 in large format is an absolutely divine experience. Those slides, when they're as large as a standard print, is something most people never get to enjoy. Now, just a factor of when I'm recording this video, 24 hours ago, I would have said to you that my only complaint about Velvia 50 is that it's made by Fuji and every year they cancel more and more of their film production line. But a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. Specifically, Fuji announced Acros 2. That said, I can't help but feel that sooner rather than later, Velvia 50 will hit the chopping block and that will be that. Fuji announcing one film stock's re-release hasn't yet re-earned my trust in their commitment to film. And that's a problem for me because there are simply no comparable stocks to Velvia 50. Velvia 50 inhabits a class. No, it inhabits an echelon to itself. Velvia 50 is a Ford Mustang GT sitting in a lot filled with Explorers. Velvia 50 is a luminized red oak flooring in a showroom full of laminate. Velvia 50 is a filet mignon butter marinated, then roasted to medium rare in a cast iron pan seasoned by 3 generations of Oklahoma farmhouse wives. Velvia 50 is amazing. This is not a beginner's film. This is not the first thing you shoot when you try photography for the first time. Velvia 50 allows for wonderful images, but you have to earn them. This is especially true in the medium and large format media. My oldest Velvia 50 images were blown out with overdone highlights burned like a toddler's hand touching an iron. I recognized that I was not yet good enough for this film. I set about getting better, and 3 years later returned to and shot significantly improved images with Velvia 50. All slide films are hard to use. Velvia 50 is easier than many, but it is far from easy. If you've never shot slide film before, try Ektachrome E100 first. See how it goes. If the results are good, then try Velvia 50. The 50 ISO slowness drinks light and it saturates each film layer, delivering richness and image quality and color. These image characteristics result from the film being used well, from a photographer who seeks to be challenged by the stock and who uses these challenges well and consistently. When you get this film, when you understand it, when you have learned to use this film well, it will be like a master violinist playing a Stradivarius at Music Verein.